Today we'll be discussing Chapter 15, Ocean Waters, the Blue of the Blue Marble. This chapter can also be referred to as oceanography, where we will discuss what we know about Earth's oceans, and it will be divided into two parts. The first part discusses density and temperature differences across the oceans and informs us how we get global ocean circulation. The second part will discuss waves and the different biozones of the oceans. The oceans make up the blue of the blue planet, and they are salty. So salt water covers 71% of Earth's surface, and thus it's a vital portion of Earth's surface that we should understand. A lot of people think that much of the oceans are unexplored and that we don't know that much about them. This is a bit of a misconception. For over hundreds of years and even millennia, humans have been studying the oceans and trying to understand them. And now in the 21st century, we have satellite data, we have ocean research vessels that go and explore oceans using geophysics and taking samples using drilling and catch sampling. And we really do know a lot about the structure of the oceans and the global Earth ocean and how it functions. What we don't know are some of the biology that exists at the very deep levels in trenches and things like that. But that's not to say that we don't understand most of the oceans. We really do, and we know that they are changing. So here we go. So here's a map by a Dutch cartographer in 1598 showing the coastlines as they were known at the time. This map is relatively accurate for Europe, Africa, and Asia, but the Americas require some adjustment over the next few hundred years. This map is also, it's important to know, is in a certain projection called a Mercator projection, and that whenever you're rendering a three-dimensional sphere, the surface of a sphere, onto a two-dimensional surface like a map, there will be some distortion in some areas. It's just impossible to do that without distortion. So in this Mercator projection, the northern and southern latitudes are much larger than they actually are. So this distortion is in near Antarctica, Siberia, and the top of North America, Greenland. As a result, the tropical and near tropical countries look much smaller in this projection. Oceanography as we know it today began in 1872, and today there's many different types of vessels that are used to study the ocean, both at and underneath the surface. So we use ships at Earth's surface like this research vessel in figure B. We use submarines like Alvin in figures C and E that go to the bottom of the ocean and take videos to look at the processes that are occurring and pick up samples and take measurements to bring back up to the surface. And then we also use unmanned or not humanly operated things like buoys on figure C that detect ambient water temperatures and water salinity and other chemical processes, and also geophysical processes, using like buoys for sonar readings or for magnetometry, understanding the magnetic readings of the ocean floor. Then finally we have satellite data. All of these things contribute to our knowledge of the oceans. We differentiate between the different oceans on Earth's surface: the Pacific, the Indian, Southern, and Atlantic and Arctic oceans. And some of these oceans are large enough to be divided into northern and southern portions. Then the smaller bodies of saltwater that are surrounded in part by some land are the seas. These would be like the Caribbean Sea, the Black Sea, Mediterranean Sea, Arabian Sea, etc. Sea level is the elevation of the boundary between the ocean water and the air above it. This changes on a day-to-day basis as a result of interactions of the global oceans with the gravitational pull or gravitational attraction between the Earth and the Moon. So at high tide, when the side of Earth that is closest to the Moon is experiencing the strongest gravitational pull, that's at high tide, and the area that is furthest away from the Moon in that part of any given day is experiencing low tide. Mean sea level is a concept that explains the average height of the boundary between ocean water and the air above or below over the course of 1 year. So sea level does change constantly on a day-to-day basis, sometimes changes on a monthly basis, but you can look at a mean sea level as an annual average sea level. And of course, over the course of several years, hundreds, thousands, or millions of years, sea level also changes. So we have to always understand our time scale of comparison. Salinity is the concentration of dissolved salts in the water. Seawater contains a variety of different dissolved minerals like magnesium, calcium, and potassium, but the main minerals are sodium and chloride, which of course combine to make table salt NaCl. Salinity of seawater varies with both depth and location, and can be defined by this thing called the halocline. This is the boundary between the surface and the deep water salinity, and the halocline exists between about 1 and 1,000 meters, and it's the same everywhere on Earth. However, the halocline is much stronger in certain latitudes than in others. So, for example, we observe the highest salinity on Earth in the tropics at the surface of the water. But then as we go deeper in the water, we see a decrease in salinity all the way to once we reach bottom waters or abyssal waters, we reach a relatively low salinity in the tropics. Now at high latitudes, the surface waters have relatively low salinity, and the salinity actually increases on its way as you go deeper, and the equator is in the middle. So this map and graph show is very important that seawater salinity changes not only with depth of the water, but also with latitude. At high latitudes, we have low salinity at the surface and higher at the bottom. And at equatorial latitudes, we have relatively mid levels of salinity from top to bottom. And in the tropics, we have very high salinity at the surface with decreasing salinity towards the bottom. All of the salinity levels converge as you go deeper with at 4,000 meters depth, you generally have the same salinity no matter what latitude you are on Earth. Similar to salinity, temperature changes also with depth of water and latitude. And the reason for this is that because of insolation or intensity of solar radiation is stronger at the equator than near the poles. So similar to the halocline, the thermocline is the boundary between layers of warm surface water and cold deeper waters. At high latitude, the thermocline doesn't change much. So we have a very low temperature water at high latitudes near the poles, at the surface and at depth. Whereas at the equator and at the tropics, we have much higher temperatures near the surface that rapidly decrease as we go down deeper into the water. If you think about this, this makes sense. If you're at the beach or at the surface of the water, it can be pretty hot on a boat. But as you go deeper and deeper, the sun is not breaking through the water and you are getting colder. So the equator is the hottest at the surface. Like like the lines for salinity changes, the changes in temperature also all converge with depth. Temperature and salinity both control something called density, and if you want to take their combination, you can create this thing called the pycnocline, and that's the region where density varies most between surface density and deeper water density. So you see the pycnocline is also less than 1,000 meters depth. The important thing here is that the density differences creates this sort of layering in the ocean into distinct water masses. So you've got warmer and less saline water at the surface, and you have colder and more saline water generally at the bottom. And these water masses, because they have differences between them in density, they move relative to one another. And when water masses move relative to one another in a normal or regular way, they're called ocean currents. And this is just the water moving faster faster in a particular direction relative to adjacent water. And there are surface currents, which are 100 to 400 meters depth, and then there are deep sea currents, which are much deeper. So one example is the Gulf Stream, which is shown here in some satellite data. We see the warm waters extending from the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico regions all the way up the east coast of North America and continuing north into the North Atlantic, where the waters start to cool and sink. So the Gulf Stream is actually a warm water surface current. The major surface currents in the global ocean are called gyres, and each of them follows the margins of the basin in which it formed. So this is related not only to ocean temperature and salinity, but the configuration of the continents as well. In the northern hemisphere, the gyres follow a clockwise pattern, and in the southern hemisphere, they follow a counterclockwise pattern. This is a result of something called the Coriolis effect. The North Pacific Gyre is notable because it has a bunch of floating garbage in it, and this mainly plastic debris forms something called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And as a result of sort of this swirling of material in the near surface of the Pacific Ocean. Global atmospheric winds control the surface ocean currents due to frictional drag. So what we have here is that we've got the continents that act as sort of buffers or borders for which the water can flow. And we've got wind coming to and from the continents from the oceans that help control the flow. So we've got that clockwise motion in the northern hemisphere again and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. The Coriolis effect is the deflection of a moving object relative to the surface of a spinning object beneath. So we know that Earth spins, if you're looking from the top down in a bird's eye view from the North Pole, it spins in a clockwise direction. So that's why the eastern regions see the sun before the western regions. And if you've got that surface of the Earth moving as it does every day, spinning one full rotation, the winds that blow on it get deflected in the northern hemisphere as a result of that spinning to the right if it's moving north, and to the right if it's moving south. So this produces a clockwise pattern in the northern hemisphere. Whereas in the southern hemisphere, if you've got winds moving north, they're going to get deflected leftwards, and also they're going to get deflected leftwards if they're moving south. This is the counterclockwise pattern. So imagine just the globe spinning. Africa is moving across the left of your screen, towards the left on your screen, and you'll see that the winds are actually going to get deflected. So these are the Coriolis effect. So wind shears the surface, creating a current, and Coriolis forces deflect the current. The layer below is sheared by the overlying layer and experiences additional deflection to the right. So imagine that the wind, if you blew across a glass of water or a hot coffee, you'd see ripples on the top of the surface. And then that water is on the top is actually creating some drag on the water below it. Each lower level, however, is deflected further to the right, and this creates a spiral motion known as the Ekman transport. Okay, this is the case for the northern hemisphere. There's also this phenomenon called coastal upwelling and downwelling. So in this case, a surface flow that moves water away from the shore can cause upwelling, and a surface flow that moves water towards the shore can cause downwelling. So in the figure to the right, we have shoreward Ekman transport due to a shore parallel wind, and then on the bottom we have a seaward Ekman transport due to a shore parallel wind. All of these factors combine to form something called the thermohaline circulation, which is the rising and sinking of water driven by density on the global scale. This circulates water throughout the ocean system, which mixes entirely over about 1,500 years, and although it may take a molecule of water hundreds to thousands of years to complete a cycle, perhaps if it's stuck in between in a dense water mass at the bottom of the ocean, or in an area that's in the center of a gyre, for example, where the North Pacific garbage patch is. Now we'll begin part 2 of the lecture, where we discuss waves and biotic zones. So waves are the periodic up and down motions of the ocean with troughs and crests that are visible to the eye. We may be familiar with waves in terms of a colloquial definition or just a visual understanding, but there are a scientific definition as well. And it's important to understand that the scientific definition for a wave in the ocean is very similar to a wave of energy for a physics question, or a sine wave or a cosine wave in mathematics or trigonometry. Really, all a wave is the energy moving through the water. So there is some sort of force that has pushed energy through the water in a wave. Ripples are small waves that develop due to the elastic behavior of the ocean surface. So they're just tiny waves that result from wind or displacement from other water. Wave trains are described as when a wave builds up to a sufficient size, gravity causes a rebound, so the water then moves up and down. So imagine yourself getting up and out of the bathtub. All of your body moving out will displace the water in the bathtub. It will rise slightly, and then it will fall down as a result of gravity and displace water on its edges, which causes waves all in the radial direction surrounding it. So wave trains propagate outwards across the water surface and can move long distances from the location of the disturbance that caused them to begin. This can be, for example, in earthquakes or volcanic eruptions underwater can create wave trains. So now let's define the wave properties. Crests are the tops of waves and troughs are the bottom of waves. The distance between crest and trough is called the wave height, and the wavelength is the distance between successive crests or successive troughs. A wave period has to do with time, so it's the time between arrival of successive crests or troughs at a certain location. And then wave base is the depth below which no wave movement takes place. So in this figure, each of those terms is described. Wave size depends on three things: the strength of the wind, the fetch, which is the distance over which the wind blows, and the length of the time the wind blows. So in this diagram, we first have the strength of the wind, then we have the fetch, and then the length of time that the wind blows. Rogue waves are isolated waves that rise more than twice as high as most large waves passing a locality during a specific time interval. These may be the result of some sort of tectonic or volcanic activity, but also may be the result of waves coming together from different directions and superimposing on top of one another to create an anomalous wave. All right, now let's discuss oceanic zones. So oceanic zones can be described based on their distance from shore. First, we have the littoral or intertidal zone, then the neritic zone, and oceanic zones. So the littoral zone is the area in which the high tide and low tide can reach on the surface. Then the neritic zone includes all of the area of continental shelves expressed in the direction of shore towards the center of the ocean. And then the oceanic zone is the area in which the continental slope and beyond extends. There's also a way to describe oceanic zones based on depth. These would be pelagic and benthic. Pelagic being the swimming environment and benthic being the near bottom environment. Another way to describe oceanic zones based on depth is through the photic and aphotic zones. These are based on light penetration, with the photic zone being the upper 1,000 meters of an ocean where light can penetrate, and the aphotic zone being anything below 1,000 meters, all the way to abyssal depths. Importantly, photosynthesis can only take place in the upper 200 meters of the ocean. This is part of the photic zone, but is a especially strong part where we have strong sunlight. Oceanic life can be described based on the different zones that they live in. So first we have plankton. These are organisms that float in the water column. And there are phytoplankton, which are photosynthetic, meaning they derive their energy from the process of photosynthesis, and zooplankton, which ingest other organisms for energy. Then we have nekton. These are organisms that swim, that have the ability to swim and propel themselves through the water. And then finally we have the benthos, which are organisms that live on or just above or just below the seafloor. Phytoplankton contain chlorophyll and can photosynthesize. Some examples are diatoms and coccolithophores, and zooplankton ingest other organisms. So examples of these are tiny shrimp, foraminifera, and radiolarians. Here's a picture of some nekton. So these are actively swimming in the open ocean, including marine mammals like whales and dolphins, fish like sharks and tuna, and many other species. Benthos live on or just below the seafloor or above the seafloor and include coral, seaweed, and sea cucumbers. Food webs are groups of organisms associated by feeding relationships. Primary producers, also known as autotrophs, are organisms that survive by extracting nutrients from non-living sources. This would be photosynthetic organisms. Also, organisms that are there are some chemosynthetic organisms, meaning that they derive their energy from some chemical reaction that doesn't have to do with solar radiation. Heterotrophs are all other organisms that are not primary producers. So all fish, mammals, humans are all heterotrophs. The main nutrients that are needed for an organism to construct chemicals and carry out metabolic reactions are phosphate, nitrate, and iron. And these nutrients enter the sea from the land and other organisms whose nutrients are returned to the water upon their death. Dissolved oxygen is needed by zooplankton and marine animals to respirate, and such oxygen may enter the ocean from the surface and then diffuse downward or come from algae as a byproduct of photosynthesis. Decomposition of algal blooms can remove oxygen and can lead to dead zones in the ocean and fresh water as well. Dead zones are prevalent along Louisiana and Texas continental shelves during the summer. Satellite image here shows the detection of chlorophyll concentrations in surface waters, and that indicates the distribution of photosynthetic organisms, which are the primary producers within a food web. So the highest concentrations of chlorophyll are in the Arctic and in the tropical areas near land. Notice that the open ocean areas do not have high in the in above and below the equator do not have strong chlorophyll concentrations. Thus, there's not much plankton there completing photosynthesis.